From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is David Feldman, along with Steve Scrovan, and the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. This week, we're going to be talking about driving and flying. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking with Paul Hudson, the president of Flyers Rights, the largest nonprofit consumer organization for airline passengers. He's going to tell us about what you should know about what airlines are putting into their fine print contracts. We'll also be checking in, as always, with our corporate crime reporter, Russell McIver. And then we'll talk a little bit about a soiree I attended last week in Ralph's hometown of Winsted, Connecticut. I'm talking about the grand opening of the American Museum of Torts. And if we have time, we'll get to some listener questions. But before we do any of that, Steve Scrovan, tell us about our first guest.
We've talked on this show about the idea of driverless cars and computers in cars and the potential for hacking and other mischief. So today we have on the show an expert on software. Eben Moglen is a professor of law and legal history at Columbia University and is the founder, director, counsel, and chairman of the Software Freedom Law Center, whose client list includes numerous pro bono clients such as the Free Software Foundation. He's been gracious enough to take time out between teaching classes to talk to us about this Volkswagen scandal as well as other things. Professor Moglen, welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you, Professor Moglen. You've made a real record over the years of pressing for free software. You've said that the idea of proprietary software is as ludicrous as having proprietary mathematics or proprietary geometry. You've also said that free software is a fundamental requirement for a democratic and free society in which we're surrounded by independent technical devices. Only if controlling these devices is open to all via free software can we balance power equally. Before we get into the automotive area, those comments of yours provoked a widespread concern about some people regarding the upcoming elections, relying on these complex voting machines that have been purchased in most voting districts in the United States by municipalities, but the proprietary software is owned by the companies. What risk do you think this is going to pose, especially since most of our presidential elections come down to 3 or 4 states like Ohio and Florida with a winner-take-all electoral college system? Can you give us some idea of whether you've had concern over this in recent elections and what should be done about it? I noted often that Canada uses a paper ballot, and by 11 o'clock at night on Election Day, they know who won and who didn't.
We need, Ralph, to understand that who counts votes in every election matters enormously. Most of the advanced democracies in the world have a nonpartisan public agency that conducts elections. In the United States, electoral administration is conducted by elected officials with partisan affiliation. And as we learned in the 2000 national election in which you were a candidate, the identity of the Secretary of State in any particular state and the partisan affiliation of that secretary can matter enormously to the outcome of local or national elections. As Earl Long, Huey Long's brother, the governor of Louisiana, said once about voting machines, "Give me the right commissioners, I make them machines play Home Sweet Home." So who counts and how they count is the crucial matter in the administration of democracy on the ground. If we use a voting machine that doesn't produce a voter-verifiable paper ballot as an audit trail, we will never be able to trust a count created by software we can't read and which might have been modified in practice. As the Volkswagen case itself that we're going to be talking about shows, it's easy to make software behave one way when it's being checked and one way when it isn't. And that's a real problem in voting machine software. Even if we're not going to rely entirely on counting paper ballots as the Canadians do, we certainly want the electronic machines that people use to leave behind a paper record that the voter can verify and that we can use to audit the eventual count.
Is that widespread now?
It's not widespread, but it's not from an engineering point of view very difficult to make widespread. And a number of university computer scientists around the United States who've worked on the issue of voting technology have recommended it. It's relatively simple to make a machine that either prints something a voter can see or presents a copy on a screen of a piece of paper which can then be kept in a roll by the machine, even if the votes are electronically transmitted to a central location for faster counting. There is at least an audit trail. The idea of the voter-verified paper ballot that leaves behind something that can be recounted is not incompatible with the convenience and speed of electronic voting. But if we leave behind no written record that history can judge of the votes cast in an election, we are asking for democracy controlled by the machine.
Indeed, there are people who claim that the election was stolen in Ohio in 2004 by this process you're describing. Well, our listeners should be very alert and ask their election officials whether there's a paper trail well before they go down to the voting precinct to vote in next year's election. Is there a paper trail that provides verification? Is very central question for voters to start asking, especially in Florida, Michigan, Ohio, and some of the swing states. Let's move over to the VW debacle. To preface that, I was impressed by a quote by Chris Gerdes, a professor of mechanical engineering at Stanford University, who said, quote, "Cars these days are reaching biological levels of complexity," end quote. And the same article said that the new car that you're buying has about 100 million or more lines of computer code, which compares with 60 million lines of code in all of Facebook. This is an incredible situation. Could you elaborate on just how vulnerable, never mind the cars are, how vulnerable the drivers are who think they're in control of the wheel, and what can happen way beyond the situation in Volkswagen, which we'll get back to? You give us some of the worst scenarios of hacking or manipulating software that can totally wreck a car on a highway.
All right, so we have two sets of concerns, right? We have failures which result from errors in software, and we have failures that result from opening the opportunity for malicious misbehavior. We computerized automobiles very heavily in the first place, primarily in order to deal with air pollution and other environmental concerns. By controlling combustion much more closely than could be done with a mechanical carburetor, it was possible to achieve the kinds of emission limitations that Clean Air Act enforcement in the United States, shall we say, after Ralph Nader, required. So we went into the business of turning cars into very complex fuel injection and ignition control and combustion control systems in which real-time measurement of temperature and air pressure and humidity was used in order to achieve exactly the right mix of gasoline and air or diesel fuel and air in a combustion chamber. We went from there to all the other kinds of computerization, anti-lock brakes and the forms of ignition control and transmission control that are computerized. And we wound up, as you say, with an extremely dense collection of software. If it fails, you could have unintended acceleration, as we have verified happened in Toyota Priuses. You could have loss of braking or changes in braking behavior if the anti-lock braking software, which pumps the brakes for you when you press down on the pedal on wet or slippery terrain, fails. You can have sudden loss of power to the entire automobile. This happened, as we now know, in many General Motors cars as a result of a defective spring. But once you make the whole electrical system of the car dependent on a push-button ignition system, it doesn't have to be a spring in key. It could be a failure in the code. We also do have enormous difficulties of hacking, and this is true the more we move towards the forms of door locks and collision avoidance systems, which are controlled from inside the car by radio fobs or other little devices that emit radio waves, and can be controlled from outside the car by the same kinds of radio signals maliciously generated. lots of car companies around the world have moved towards higher and higher levels of radio frequency automated control. We all are accustomed to the fact that you press your button halfway across the parking lot and the horn goes off and the lights blink and the door opens. But you also have radio controlled actual ignition and engine warming, particularly for cars in cold climates. Once you begin to turn all of that into a consumer's expectation of convenience, you're also turning it into a cracker's paradise, because generating all those radio signals and controlling the car from abroad can be easily enough accomplished. A hacker team in the United States recently showed the ability to take over a Jeep brand automobile on the road and turn off its drivetrain and its ignition remotely by radio signals. That really means the opportunity to kill the occupants of the car.
Well, this is a good background to get into the VW situation. Describe that briefly. What was the incentive for whoever in VW rigged the software in order to hide the fact that the pollution emissions from so far 11 million Volkswagens was much higher than the government standards provided for? So give a description of that.
So both at the bottom of the price level of VW automobiles, in Skoda and in VW, and at the top in the Audi line of more luxury cars, VW was building and selling more cars than anybody else around the world, its great ambition, in part on the basis of so-called clean diesel technology. The problem with diesel cars is that they are either very underpowered, you press the accelerator and a little time later you begin to move, or they are very dirty because combustion of heavier fuel produces more particulates and more undesirable gases output from combustion. So VW, Audi, Porsche was building and selling a lot of cars around the world that were supposedly comparatively inexpensive because diesels are cheap to build and very clean. And of course it wasn't really very clean, but they needed it to appear to be very clean. And so it is apparent that with the complicity of a fairly large number of engineers and other servants of the VW empire, cars were built whose software was designed to determine whether the engine was being emission tested, and if it was being emission tested, to turn on a whole bunch of features that would make the engine burn clean, but would not be economical or fun to drive. When it is on the road, it becomes more economical and more fun to drive by emitting large quantities of poison gases, which the regulations don't permit. So, if I may risk a joke which you and I share, we have gone from unsafe at any speed to poisons bystanders regardless how slowly you drive. And once again, as many decades ago when you first brought all this to the world's attention, we are dealing with automaker subterfuge, cover-up, and refusal to admit facts. The nature of VW's code, where clean when tested and dirty when driven, was discovered not only by researchers in the United States operating more or less by accident. We now know that it was also discovered by crucial VW suppliers. Bosch, the maker of, among other things, the spark plugs and other ignition gear in VW cars, which reported to VW, we are told many years ago, that there was a problem with emissions and with the record of the emission control software about which VW did nothing. It was a business strategy. Make cars which look and feel great, say they're clean, make them behave cleanly, and let them dirty everybody's lungs every other part of the day.
We're talking with Professor Eben Moglen of Columbia University Law School. And listeners should know that in the United States, the certification of cars to meet EPA pollution control standards is done in a laboratory owned by a private company. And it is not real-world testing, it's lab testing. And when the car hits the real world with you behind the wheel, the emissions are considerably higher than what is sent to EPA by the manufacturer as a certified product. In Europe, apparently, the auto companies are allowed to pick their own private testers. So either way, the problem starts with this outsourcing of testing, in part because the EPA has such a tiny budget and they really don't have the specialists or the equipment to do it themselves. So let me ask you this question, Professor Moglen. Let's say you're an owner of one of these cars. You like its relatively good mileage, power, torque. You get a recall notice from VW, and you say to yourself, I don't want to take this car back. I don't want to lose those advantages in return for some reported reduction of my auto emissions. How would you deal with that? With an incentive payment required by the government on VW? How would you actually get these cars recalled? And then what do you think VW can do by way of a fix, or should they be required if the owners are willing to buy back these cars?
Now, we have, of course, Ralph, a global problem and not just a U.S. problem, and the regulatory environment differs. The EPA does not have the power to take cars off the road. It can, under these circumstances, stimulate a recall, acting with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, but they can't bench the cars. In Germany, the regulators do have the power to order non-compliant cars off the road. This is going to cause for the VW empire an enormous problem in their own home world. If in the United States we had the power to tell people, look, you just can't drive it, it's not California road safe, that would cause people to have the recall work done and the software replaced. But I must tell you that although I think you're right, that there are a lot of consumers who will think, why should I take this in? It's only going to make my car worse. There are also a lot of consumers who bought these cars because of the clean diesel promise. I was in Los Angeles this weekend, which we can think of as ground zero of this issue. And I was talking to a lot of people around UCLA, many of whom bought VW clean diesel cars because they thought that they were being part of the improving the environment for everybody. And they don't even just want the software repaired. They want VW to give them what it sold them, which was a clean diesel automobile. It is very difficult for VW to deliver that. As you say, they can fix the software so it runs all the time clean as advertised, but consumers will get a very different performing car. Their engines will last less long because they will run substantially hotter. They will buy more fuel, and they will pay more for it, particularly, let us say, in the California market where all automobile fuel is very high priced for reasons we are constantly assured have nothing to do with market manipulation. The consequence of which is that VW is going to have a lot of dissatisfied customers. Moreover, in the United States and in California in particular, they're going to have a lot of legal problems. Every contract in California implies a duty of good faith and fair dealing. And I have no doubt whatever that there are California class action lawyers doing the Lord's work in this instance who are going to be out there asserting that VW has breached its duty of good faith and fair dealing every single time it sold a so-called clean diesel car in California. This is why the estimates of the cost to VW, which are based on the EPA's fining capacity, which seems extremely large, that is, it amounts to $18 billion if you assume the maximum $37,000 fine from EPA per automobile, are nothing to the actual damages to irate consumers. You're right that stimulating the ones who simply want a diesel that's fun to drive to go in and get their software replaced may be part of the problem. But the bigger problem is the enormous angst created among a population, particularly in the most car-conscious part of the United States, that wanted cleanliness and cheapness and have been cheated on the deal.
Professor Moglen, on this issue, which almost nobody has talked about, and you're a law professor, you've worked on damages. Apart from the damages to the consumer, there are damages to breathers of dirtier air, and they're not exactly going to have explicit standing to sue. How would you, as a policy matter, advise EPA or NHTSA to deal with the damages that Volkswagen should pay for the indeterminate number of respiratory diseases or even statistical fatalities from massively polluting the air more?
Well, it is going to be very difficult. As you know, it is hard to establish the kind of causation necessary to put a lawsuit like this in the Museum of Torts. We are beginning to get some proxy measurements for how many deaths might be caused by putting so many extra tons of nitrous oxide into California's air. I would not be totally surprised if we got some lawsuits by California municipalities on the basis of harm to natural resources, which is the most likely form of claim concerning this, in which the harm to natural resources would be shown by raising the background rate of asthma and respiratory failures and so on that come from excess nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. From a regulator's point of view, this is like the ozone rule that the EPA is now going to be forced to announce late in the president's second term instead of early in his first one. If you set the ozone requirements at 70 parts per billion, you're going to have a certain number of industrial costs to pay and a certain number of excess deaths avoided. If you drop it a few more parts per billion, you will get a lot more asthma out of the system, a lot fewer children having asthma attacks, and a lot fewer deaths, but you will also raise regulatory costs substantially. I think the way the regulators are going to look at this may ultimately turn out to be, is there such a thing as clean diesel, and should there be diesels on American roads? Diesel is not a very big part of the American overall automotive drivetrain picture.
That's
and
true.
As you know, every time you look at a picture of a California highway, you see more and more hybrids there.
That's right.
My guess is that what really is going to come out of the VW situation for U.S. regulators is that the U.S. landscape will tilt even more strongly in favor of hybrid and even more strongly against diesel. And what is now 3, 4, 5% of the U.S. automotive market for diesel drivetrains will simply go close to zero.
Yeah, let me ask you this. Before we get to your proposed reform, which is making automotive code public, which the EPA doesn't want to do and the auto manufacturers don't want to do, let me ask you a more basic question. Are we seeing an expansion of the potential for tampering or manipulating software with automotive fleets all over the world by various manufacturers? Are we entitled to ask the question, just like there was too much style over safety years ago in motor vehicle design, are we entitled to ask the question, is there too much over-computerization given often minor and trivial benefits and conveniences? And should we open up that whole can of worms before the driver is just a robot behind the wheel and is subject to all these computerized systems outside his or her control?
In some sense, if we do that, we will wind up compromising parts of what we really do want by way of safety and environmental outcome. If we're going to build all electric automobiles, even if we're not Elon Musk at Tesla with 47 computers per car, we're still going to wind up using much more digital technology to make battery-powered zero-emission vehicles work. Whether we wind up with driverless cars or not, as Google and Uber both hope, we do need working collision avoidance systems. We've spent all the time since Ford Motor Company pioneered seatbelts under McNamara in the 1950s, basically trying to prevent the consequences of collisions without preventing collisions. Anti-lock braking, which made bad drivers brake as though they were good drivers, is the best we ever did on that subject. We now have the opportunity, using various forms of near-field communication and low-power radar, actually to begin making collision avoidance possible in automobiles, and a lot of lives will be saved by that. I'm not sure that the result is to go downward in computation power of cars. It may or may not work. But what we ought to do is make sure that cars are built of safe materials, however they are powered and controlled. If we have bad steel that rusts quickly in automobiles, we will take people's lives because rust kills. If we have bad software that can't be inspected by anybody except the manufacturer, one way or another, we will have bad software. It is true, as you say, that regulatory agencies are underfunded and understaffed. But when it comes to inspecting software, the problem is even worse than it is in other places. Software engineering is expensive for government to acquire and keep because software engineers can earn good money in private business. And having enough software expertise in EPA to do emissions control software and in NHTSA to do steering control software or ignition software and so on becomes overwhelmingly duplicative. When NHTSA tried to investigate whether software was causing unintended acceleration in Toyota Priuses, one model of car, one possible software failure, they did not have enough engineering to accomplish that task. And NHTSA borrowed 50 software engineers from NASA, the space agency, in order to have enough in-house capacity to solve one software inspection problem.
This is a very important point that Professor Moglen is making. Let me illustrate it. The entire budget for NHTSA that deals with tens of thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of injuries every year, the entire budget is smaller than the budget that the State Department expends on guarding the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and its personnel. $650 million to guard the U.S. Embassy and its personnel in Baghdad, Iraq. And NHTSA's budget is under $400 million a year. So this is a very serious problem. Next time you listeners have an opportunity to contact your members, make that point very clear. There are very few federal cops on this corporate crime and deceptive beat. Let's get in our closing minutes, Professor Moglen, your proposal for automotive code being made public as a safeguard against the repeat of what is probably going to happen with other manufacturers in software unable to resist temptation or otherwise hacking through it by others.
Or just making terrible mistakes. What we need to do, Ralph, is to make the software in cars, like the steel in cars and the wire in cars, inspectable. It won't work to have a government agency, even if Ralph Nader is president and he moves the defense budget into NHTSA, it won't do to believe that a government agency can do a better job than the whole of civil society. We got a lot of engineering talent and a lot of programmer talent out in the world, and it could see that the Pinto gas tank mounted outside the frame rails up against the sheet metal of the back of the Pinto was not a good way to make a car. And everybody could see why it was that rear-end collisions produced fires. We need to be able to make software inside things as obviously available for civil society to inspect as physical devices and the materials are. We're not only talking about cars, we're talking about medical devices, pacemakers and insulin pumps, and other things whose software failures can kill a person within seconds. We had one person that by accident found the mistakes in VW code. But as pretty much every academic and industry commentator not working for the automobile industry has said in the last 10 days, if the code had been available for inspection, this would have been found years ago. And precisely because it would have been found years ago, Volkswagen would never have taken the risk. We're talking about transparency as a regulatory strategy. Everybody knows that disclosure is a good regulatory strategy under certain circumstances, and this is one.
And one of your champions is Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, who is co-sponsor of the computer security bill, that he would open up access to vehicle source code so that deceit could be prevented. Are you in touch with him, and what's going on given this brouhaha?
I haven't spoken to Senator Blumenthal, but I recognize that crusading Attorney General still in the Senator, and I deeply hope that he succeeds in calling attention to the problem. You understand that regulatory agencies like EPA often oppose transparency. They think of the user as the person who needs to be regulated. The EPA justified assisting the automobile industry in concealing code in cars by saying that if code in cars was readable, individuals would use that opportunity to make illegal modifications. This is a regulatory position which makes sense only until you catch a car company cheating. There is no possibility that revealing the code in automobiles would have caused 11 million drivers illegally to modify their cars to create smog. Only a failure at the center can be as damaging as that. Regulators have to stop regulating consumers and start regulating businesses. But that's the problem of regulatory capture. Consumers sit out here. There's one in a house. Industry sits inside the agency with high-paid people doing their work, explaining things to the agency. At the end of the day, it's much easier for regulators to sympathize with manufacturers than it is for them to sympathize with individual users.
Another way of putting it, Professor, everybody's smarter than any of us. And opening up the code, even if someone wants to be malicious, they'll be checkmated by others who will catch them. You know, Thomas Dulien, a well-known security researcher, I think put the gravity of the impending future here that's coming on fast, illustrated by the VW debacle. He said, quote, "The reality is that more and more decisions, including decisions about life and death, are being made by software," end quote. Your comment?
Yes, more and more decisions about life and death and who we meet and what we say to them and how our world is constructed. We are becoming human beings living inside an enormous network of machines which serve us until they don't. The only way to make that society just and fair as well as safe is to put human beings in control of the technology they use in their lives. The automobile is the single densest collection of software you're not allowed to read, study, modify, fix, or understand in most people's lives. They leave behind a tablet or personal computer they barely understand. They put a smartphone in their pocket. They walk out the door with an awful lot of technology tracking them and following them. But when they get into the car, they are surrounded by technology which understands them far better than they will ever know it. And if it's cheating them, good luck.
Welcome to the future, listeners. How can they reach you, Professor Moglen, if they want to comment or get into your website to learn more?
Moglen at softwarefreedom.org, http softwarefreedom.org. May you live 1,000 years, Ralph, and thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, and to be continued. This is going to be a continuing situation, and we've got to be on top of it. If we aren't, who's going to be on top of it? Thank you again, Professor Eben Moglen of Columbia University Law School.
Thank you so much.
We've been talking to Eben Moglen, who is a professor of law and legal history at Columbia University and is the founder of the Software Freedom Law Center. For more on the work they do over there, go to softwarefreedom.org. Now, Ralph, I wanted to ask you about an area which is probably more your wheelhouse. Last week, the CEO of Volkswagen, Martin Winterkorn, now he resigned amidst this VW scandal. And at the time of his resignation, this kind of stuck out to me. He said, and I quote, "I'm not aware of any wrongdoing on my part," which I thought was an interesting way to phrase that. He kind of leaves the door open. You know, there could be wrongdoing on my part, but I'm going to leave that to others to find out. Now, with your knowledge of auto company bureaucracy, is there any chance he didn't know what was going on?
Well, that's lawyer talk to their client. You know, in the United States, the linguistic version of what you just cited is when CEOs say, "To my knowledge, I wasn't responsible for this problem." You know, "to my knowledge," that's the exit phrase. It's really doubtful. Obviously, this was done by people who are expert inside Volkswagen on software. There's some evidence that other people inside Volkswagen blew the whistle internally and were ignored. But when you're dealing with 11 million vehicles and you have a distinctive marketing profile of diesel engine cars, if you're not aware of it at the CEO level, you're not aware of the company you're running. What's interesting, though, is the tradition in Asia and Europe of resignations by CEO is much more robust than it is in the U.S. You didn't see heads of the auto companies resigning in the U.S. or oil companies or chemical companies. They're much more resistant to resignation.
Very good. Now let's go to the National Press Building and check in with Russell Mokhiber for the latest Corporate Crime Minute.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Wednesday, September 30, 2015. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Brookings Institution is forcing one of its top economists to resign amid questions from Senator Elizabeth Warren about an economic study funded by the business community. Robert Lighton will formally submit his resignation, the Hill newspaper reported. Warren sent a letter to Brookings suggesting that Lighton used his Brookings affiliation to peddle an industry-backed study that's critical of the Obama administration's proposed regulations for financial advisors. Obama and Warren have pushed for new disclosure requirements to ensure that consumers understand that their financial advisors might receive payments from financial institutions after selling them advice. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Before we get to our next guest, David, last week you went to Ralph's hometown of Winsted, Connecticut for the opening of the American Museum of Tort Law. What was that experience like for you?
Well, as Ralph has pointed out, it's the only law museum in America, which I find shocking. It's fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough, especially with the leaves changing. People who are visiting New York City should drive up to Winsted, Connecticut, and get a lesson in the history of law. Ralph, when we were driving up, I took my daughter, we were driving up, and there was a horrible car accident. There was a car flipped over, and there was rubbernecking. I tried not to look, but I turned to my daughter, and I said, we're on the very roads that Ralph Nader drove on. How many lives in that accident have been saved because of Ralph Nader? What did you see growing up? I'm just curious on those roads.
Well, they weren't divided highways, and people would barrel along, and I can't tell you how many times in my own high school that students were seriously injured or killed on these roads. And it was like a common occurrence. They would be injured, they'd miss school, they'd lose their lives. And the death toll now per 100 million vehicle miles is about 1.2 deaths statistically per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. And when I was writing Unsafe and Needing Speed, it was 5.4 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. So you can see the progress.
Right.
Because of you, not to embarrass you, but because of you. Winsted, Connecticut, the other thing I thought, I don't mean to be glib, is there are two famous men from Winsted, Connecticut, you and David Halberstam, and he died in a car accident.
Yes, he survived the wars in the Congo, Vietnam, the riots and civil rights and police brutality in the South, and then he was being driven by an already proven reckless driver who made the wrong turn, and David was struck in the side of the car and lost his life. This is one of the reasons why the American Museum of Torts is so important, because it relates to everybody's experience, whether they take medicines that have bad side effects, whether they're malpractice in the hospital, breathing toxic pollution in the workplace, eating contaminated foods, the kind of massive experience that people have in having to address risks, and when they materialize and they're attributed to a wrongdoer or a perpetrator, the law of torts kicks in for them. They can go to a lawyer on a contingent fee and file the case in court, and nobody can stop them. If you want to get something from the legislatures, you got to beg or pay. You want to get something from the executive branch, you got to beg and delay and bureaucracy. But if you want to get justice in the court of law, you make the decision. You make the decision, and you can get that case filed. Doesn't mean you're going to win, but you're in the arena where it's all open, verbatim transcripts, judge, jury, lawyers, press there. It's the best direct democracy decision system in the world.
Well, in this week's New Yorker, David Shapiro wrote a very nice account of the opening this weekend, and he mentioned something I'd never heard of. And I've done a lot of research on you, Ralph, for the movie and everything. He said there were some EMT workers who came across the street and wanted you to, I think, sign their manual because you were responsible for this thing called the Nader pin. What is the Nader pin?
Well, it may surprise you, but that was news to me. I don't know what the Nader pin was.
Really?
It just gets into the colloquial context of emergency workers. Like the Nader bell is when those vehicles start backing up, right? Trucks start backing up. They so that someone isn't run over on a rearward moving vehicle, and they call that the Nader bell. I don't know where it came from.
But that's the pin that keeps car doors from flying open on impact, correct?
Yes. And to an emergency worker, that is extremely important because if you're ejected from a car, your chances of being killed are many-fold greater than staying in the car, especially if you're restrained by a seatbelt and an airbag. So live and learn. And the amazing thing is the people who visited the museum came out. I mean, they were edified. It didn't pander to them. It didn't over-electronically razzmatazz them. They just stood there looking at the graphic portrayals and the descriptions of the cases, and then looked at the portrayal that's called Questions for Thought. These cases would ask the viewers, the visitors, what do you think of this? And would you think differently if this fact was changed? So they went out of the museum with word of mouth aplenty, which is more than you can say for most museums, which concentrate on one subject matter.
Right. Well,
I have one quick question that I was talking with my daughter about Winstead. It's a beautiful city, and there's that cliche, think globally, act locally. You're very involved, I would assume, in Winstead, Connecticut. I would assume that if you don't like something that's happening in Winstead, you fight it. Is that correct?
Well, I'm mostly in Washington, D.C., but our family has really taken a great sense of responsibility. My brother started with a small group of citizens. He conceived and started the first community college in Connecticut, in Winstead, when the factories were closing down and deindustrialization was setting in. And my sister started and supervised as a community lawyer, a nonprofit community lawyer, to help people when they want to interact with City Hall and decipher the legal jargon, etc. It also helped to reestablish the Winstead Health Center when the Winstead Memorial Hospital closed down after 100 years and left 30,000 or so people in the catchment area without any urgent care. So that's now humming along very well. I think it goes back to caring for your community.
Well, now Winstead has the American Museum of Tort Law. Make plans to visit that. It's very edifying. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Paul Hudson about your rights as an airline passenger. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Don't go away.
Stand up. Oh, stand up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, stand up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. As many of our listeners know, when U.S. Airways bumped Ralph from a flight on his way to a speaking engagement in 1974, he sued. And that's why to this day, passengers get compensated for being bumped off of flights. Our next guest also fights for the rights of airline passengers. David, tell us about him.
Paul Hudson has been a groundbreaking public interest advocate for over 30 years. In the 1970s, he was doing it in energy and utility policy as attorney for the New York Public Interest Research Group. In the 1980s, he did it as a crime victims' rights attorney. He was chief attorney for the New York Crime Victims Board. In the 90s, up until 2012, he worked for air travelers and terrorist victims, leading the Pan Am 103 Lockerbie bombing victim family organization and the Aviation Consumer Action Project. He's a longtime member of the FAA's Aviation Rulemaking Advisory Committee, representing the public and advising the FAA on air safety regulation, and the FAA TSA Aviation Security Advisory Committee. From 2001 to 2013, he represented victims of lengthy tarmac confinements in a series of court cases. Thank you for that. I've had some of the worst panic attacks waiting on the tarmac. Paul Hudson has been interviewed hundreds of times by the media on aviation consumer issues and is frequently quoted in major media, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, USA Today, NBC News, ABC News, etc., etc. Welcome, Paul Hudson.
Well, thank you for that long introduction. Glad to be still here.
Good to have you on the program, Paul. Paul and I and others worked together over the years through a group called Aviation Consumer Action Project, ACAP, which I founded back in the 70s. And he now wears two hats, that one, ACAP, as well as the Flyers' Rights organization. It's called flyersrights.org. I just want to tell the listeners how a tiny number of people can create such important services for airline passengers. One of the plaudits for the Flyers' Rights Group has this to say. In October 2008, airlines must report tarmac data for canceled, diverted, or multiple gate return flights. In May 2008, Flyers' Rights Organization, which was started by an angry passenger who was stranded on the tarmac with other passengers in Detroit, Kate Hanney. In 2008, bumping compensation doubled from $200 to $400 respectively to $400 and $800 respectively. In December 2009, the 3-hour tarmac rule for domestic flights was established, and many other things, including in 2011, there was another increase in bumping compensation to $250 and $1,300 respectively. So it just goes on, and I've talked with Paul about this, and he can comment on it. I have no idea why airline passengers don't gravitate to these small groups and expand their staff and budgets by contributing membership dues. It's almost like airline passengers grumble and then figure, well, someone else will do it. Well, nobody will do it if the airline passengers don't do it. What's your view on this, Paul Hudson?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've been involved, as you know, for quite a while. The dues paying doesn't really seem to work too well. Everything now is supposed to be free, and other people pay for it. But we are gratified that the internet has made organizing national, international groups much easier now, and social media is added to that. So we started with just really one person who put up a little blog in 2007 early, thinking, well, maybe there's some other people that had similar experiences to being stranded. And within a few weeks, she got 10 to 20,000 people signing up. And today we have an office in Washington, D.C. We have a small staff, but mostly we operate with dedicated volunteers. And there is strength in numbers. And if some people will contribute, whether it's money, time, and effort, a lot, as you say, is really possible.
And what passengers can also do to help Paul Hudson and others do their work is send them documented complaints when they are interacting with airlines, either up in the air or on the ground or at the ticket counter or on the phone. That helps. And they can send these complaints to flyersrights.org. That's FLYERS rights, RIGHTS.org. And send the same complaint to the Department of Transportation, which actually tabulates them by airlines and releases them periodically. And the airlines look at those rankings between themselves in terms of the number of complaints quite closely. You've been focusing recently on airline contracts, the fine print that most airline passengers never see. Can you explain what you're doing in this area?
So when you buy a ticket on an airline, you're really agreeing to a contract with the airline called a contract of carriage. It's known in the law as a contract of adhesion. It's take it or leave it. And unless there's some regulation otherwise, the airline can pretty much say or do whatever they want in these contracts. And they have recently gone beyond the normal things, and they're now getting into redefining what were always normal terms, like the acts of God, for instance, which normally meant the weather or or war or something like that, airlines are now saying in some of their contracts that acts of God includes a shortage of equipment or personnel, which would normally be considered their responsibility. The other thing we're looking at in these contracts is that they don't alert passengers to some very basic rights that they have, for instance, for delay compensation. Most people don't realize it, but since 2003, you've had the right to get compensation for delays on international flights or international trips, even if the delay occurs in the U.S., and that amount runs up to $2,600. But you never know that from reading these contracts or even from going on the DOT website. So we're asking the FAA to require that some basic consumer information be included in these contracts.
Are many people taking advantage of that you know of, going for up to $2,600 if there's a long delay of a flight from New York Kennedy Airport to Paris or Berlin or Tokyo?
No, we calculate it's well over $1 billion in lost compensation. And there are very, very few cases that are brought under this. Furthermore, the treaty provides that it's on a modified no-fault basis. So it's the burden of proof is on the airlines to prove that they took all reasonable steps to avoid the delay. There's also delay compensation rights you have under EU rules. So if you're flying to or within Europe, there's a fixed schedule for delay compensation there. Once again, the airlines will not tell you that, and neither will the DOT.
How long does the airline get to delay free? In other words, when does this compensation process kick in? After 30 minutes or what?
No, it has to be several hours, and typically we're talking 2 to 3 hours minimum. However, the other thing most people don't realize, it doesn't just cover under the Montreal Convention your out-of-pocket expenses. One of the features of these airline contracts is they disclaim all liability for what are called consequential damages, like you missed an appointment for, could be a doctor visit, it could be business, could be something else. You lost time from work. This treaty overrides all the provisions that would normally not allow you to get full compensation for whatever the losses you suffered are.
Paul, tell our listeners some of the things you're working on to improve their services as they interact with airlines and every day.
Well, we recently filed last month a very detailed rulemaking petition with the FAA to set minimum seat size standards and also for legroom. Presently, the government does not regulate, except to a very limited degree, anything to do with seats. So what's happened is the airlines have been shrinking seats, they've been shrinking passenger space to the point where the average passenger cannot fit into many of the economy seats. And if you're oversized, like you're over 6'2", which is about 10% of the population, then the only way you're going to fit is if you overlap into your neighbor's space. So we're asking that be set. The airline seats were designed in the 1950s, and the average woman today weighs the same as the average man did in 1960. In other words, 163 pounds. The average man now weighs 185 pounds. These seats were not meant for that kind of weight. They were not meant for that kind of size of person. People have also gotten older. So this is another thing that's really caused a lot of problems, not just for comfort, but for safety. It's unclear if passengers can really evacuate under FAA rules in an emergency situation with these cramped seats.
The FAA has a rule that says that in an emergency on the ground, an airliner has to be evacuated in 90 seconds. Is that still the rule? Right. And look how impossible it is.
That is the rule, and the rule is based on actual experience where if you don't get out of the airplane within 90 seconds, the chances of you dying from smoke or fire or water are very high. Most people survive a crash landing, but they die because they can't get out in time. So the rule says you have to be able to evacuate all passengers within 90 seconds in low-light conditions with half the exits disabled. Now, the way the airlines have gotten around that is they don't require any more actual tests. So they just do a computer or analysis. And, of course, when the airline does the analysis, they never fail the test. However, even those analysis tests have not been done for some of the cramped seating that's currently used on many airliners.
So move into the area of airline passenger safety. Fortunately, the record has been pretty good over the last decade or more, domestically at least. But there's always safety standards that are obsolete, or new safety standards are required for new kinds of aircraft. And there is a difference, as we all know, between the safety of large passenger jets and the feeder airlines that go into the more rural areas of our country, as well as pilot standards that tend to be different. Can you enlighten our listeners on some of those topics, Paul Hudson?
Yes, one area that wasn't deregulated in 1978 was safety, when the airlines were pretty much deregulated with everything else. And I think because of that regulation still being in place, and air travel, especially for large airliners, has gotten much safer. However, when you go down the food chain to what are called regional airlines, they have generally less qualified pilots. Planes are more fragile. They don't, until recently at least, been required to meet the same stringent safety standards. And when you go down further into general aviation, which is private planes, or into helicopters, the casualty rate and the accident rate in those things hasn't really budged.
Tell the listener your role on the FAA Advisory Committee.
Advisory Committee in 1993. The idea was, instead of doing backdoor lobbying, they would have a representative committee that would advise them on rulemaking. And it would act as a workshop for perhaps fast-tracking safety regulations. Well, as many things, it hasn't quite worked out that way, but it does provide a forum, at least, where passenger representatives such as myself can sit around a big table every 3 months and talk about at least some of the major issues of concern to the public with regard to safety. People can get involved by going to flyersrights.org website. They can email us at paul@flyersrights.org. We also operate a hotline for airline passenger emergencies, which is 877-FLYERS-6, also available on the website. And we have a weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to. It's free. Comes out every Tuesday morning, of interest to most airline passengers. And finally, you can sign online petitions if you agree with some of the reforms, and volunteer or donate money to make sure that air travel is restored to at least partially to the way it used to be.
Thank you very much, Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights, and all your long work on airline safety.
Thank you, Ralph, so much.
We've been talking to Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights. If you've had a bad experience on a flight and get no satisfaction from the airline, there is a place to go. Go to flyersrights.org. Well, that's our show. I want to thank our guest today, Eben Moglen, founder of the Software Freedom Law Center. Go to softwarefreedom.org. And also thanks to Paul Hudson of Flyers Rights. Go to flyersrights.org. For Ralph's weekly blog, go to nader.org. For the American Museum of Tort Law, go to tortmuseum.org. If you have missed any of this show on the radio, go to ralphnaderradiohour.com or subscribe for free on iTunes or Stitcher. All of our shows are archived there with valuable links to our guests and their work. There is also a link to Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2001 to 2015. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. We'll talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, David. And for our listeners, connect with Professor Moglen and Paul Hudson. If you have information for them or you want information from them, it all starts with you, the people.